This is Get Uncomfortable, the podcast where we talk race, politics, religion, and all the things with me, Adam Smith. The recent murder of Tyree Nichols at the hands, feet, and batons of 5 Memphis police officers ignites conversations about the foundational roots of policing and if it is even possible to reform a system that was created to protect and serve the few from the many. Today, we talk policing, defunding, and reimagining a system where all members of the public feel and are safe with Dr. Timothy Berry. Dr. Berry is Interim Associate Vice President for Faculty Affairs and Equity Initiatives at Minnesota State University. Prior to his current role, he served as Dean for the School of Urban Education at Metropolitan State University. He speaks in schools, universities, conferences, businesses, and churches to share his insights and research surrounding race, literacy, and the arts. Timothy is an award-winning composer, singer, actor, and percussionist, performing a variety of music genres, including his soul drum series, which stems from West African, Afro-Cuban, and African-American music traditions. Dr. Berry, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's always good to be with you, brother.
Always good. I really appreciate your time. Looking forward to kind of getting uncomfortable with you, talking about some of the issues related to policing in our country. We have just experienced, as another guy from the Twin Cities, we've walked through uprisings related to George and Amir and Dante and Philando. And still no change, right? Nothing has really changed. How are you feeling personally? Just how are you doing? Especially as a guy from Minneapolis, the epicenter of change, where the uprisings happened and so many highly public reverberations happened. How are you feeling today, especially in light of the fact of now we have Tyree, and we don't really see much change?
Well, I always start with how I feel. When you say how I feel, I lean into my actual central nervous system. And I'm bothered. I'm bothered as a Black man by yet again contemplating whether or not the next time could be me or my son or somebody else I love, or even somebody else in the community. And so my heart is always a little more impacted the more that these things continue to occur and the more that this country shows us what it thinks about Black bodies. And so, and at the same time, because I have a practice of somatic exercise that's necessary to keep in the struggle, I'm breathing and I take an intentional breath to continue to speak sort of a truth and also speak to the issue in ways that I think in my field, at least as an educator, are hopefully substantive for people to start to grapple with this in more sophisticated ways than currently we, I think, have been able to do as a collective. So that's where I'm at, and that's where I'm sitting with this.
Yeah. I mean, the hardest part, like you talked about more sophisticated ways, right? You continue to hear, well, we can't defund the police. We need to reform. We need more diverse police officers. We need more training. The part that drives me crazy is that those maniacs in Memphis who murdered that brother, they were all trained. Right? I mean, it isn't like they didn't have training and reform and all the things. So for me, a lot of this centers on the historical roots of policing. And when people say we have to reform something, I don't know if we can reform something whose roots are grounded in doing exactly what policing does. So can you talk a little bit for us about some of the origins of policing, some of the histories of policing, and if you think as an institution, it is one that can be reformed, or is it something that just has to be reimagined?
I'll start with the last thing you said, and then I'll talk about why. And this is I so appreciate this conversation because not only does the conversation have to be more sophisticated and more nuanced, we got to have a grown-up conversation about this. So anybody tuning in, this is the grown-up conversation. And let me say, again, it can't be reformed. And so, because if you think about training, they did exactly what they were trained to do. And reformation in terms of that kind of training, all they're doing is doubling down on more and more tactical skills necessary to abuse us. And so to me, I think about then, let's talk about the lineage and the connection of policing. I do a presentation and I actually have artifacts. One of the elders that I'm in community with on time to time happens to be the Hall of Fame, former Minnesota Viking, Alan Page, who actually collects artifacts. And he gave me some insightful, wisdom on how to think about that. He said, the thing about artifacts is the facts. The thing about looking at and examining an artifact is the fact. And so I have artifacts. And one that I use in a presentation I do on race and justice is a badge. But it's the 5 stars, the badge. But this badge says slave patrol, runaway slave patrol. And I put that side by side with the current day county deputy sheriff badge, and you can pick any city of your choice, USA, and that shape is the same. So what we're talking about is an institution that never, ever, ever basically disassociated itself from its origin in terms of modern policing only actually happening after emancipation, after the Great Migration. You didn't see quote unquote professional police forces until we started showing up in numbers, in major metropolitan areas that grew into large cities and so forth. And then you have professional police forces. Think about Boston was one of the first places, if you look at historically, that had a professional police force in terms of hiring people into quote unquote that profession, with numbers growing, right? We're not talking about just a lawman or a law person in one. We're talking about an actual profession where many people were recruited. And by the way, there's a lot of scholarship around who started showing up. It was Confederates initially. It was people who are Klan members all of a sudden showing up to, sign up to become police officers. And so I think lastly about this notion of like what we can do. So let me say, like, reform is not my word, but it needs to be renegotiated. It needs to be renegotiated, right? Like, what do we want to have as far as who will actually keep the quote unquote peace?
Right.
So to me, reform doesn't work, and it hasn't worked because they're just learning and reifying what their training has been.
And it doesn't, and like you're saying, it doesn't matter. You can take all the Evian you want and dump it into the sewer. It's going to be crap water.
That's right.
Right. So you can take all the pure intended people that go into so-called law enforcement, no matter what their race is, and you dump them in the sewer, they're going to smell, taste, be sewer water, because the entire profession has those roots in slave catching. And like you said so eloquently, not only Alan Page, for the people who are non-Minnesotans, Alan Page was the last defensive player to win MVP in the NFL, Hall of Famer. Okay. but Alan Page is a whole Supreme Court justice in the state of Minnesota.
Right.
So we ain't talking about some dude who's just a football player.
That's right.
We're talking about Supreme Court Justice Alan Page,
That's
right? That's a bad boy.
Yeah.
And when he is talking about someone who is in that very system of criminal justice, ideas of artifacts being the facts, when people say, well, I've never heard of that. Well, what Dr. Berry is talking about is straight up facts that policing as we know it happened in northern cities, Boston, Chicago, as a result of the Great Migration of the 20s, most of it, right? Where it was okay now, northern cities, we've got to control these folks that have come from the South to work in these different industries, Minneapolis being one of them, in the mills, right? And the stockyards of Chicago and in Boston and in Detroit. We've now got to control these people with some type of an invading force, right? And it is doing exactly what it was built to do. Timothy, you're in the Twin Cities. So the whole world watched issue 2 in Minneapolis, which was essentially, for people who don't know, issue 2 was on the ballot, and it was all about taking the police commission and replacing it with a public safety commission, right? Taking the Minneapolis Police Department and replacing it with a Department of Public Safety that would be appointed by the city council, and then they would manage everything related to keeping the public safe, preventative and interventive, right? All of these different things. And in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis, issue 2 failed. And when you hear people talk about why they voted no, right? They said, well, we just needed more information. They didn't give us enough information on what it would look like. My biggest fear is if Minneapolis, in the wake of George and, well, not Amir at the point, but Dante and Philando and all of these cases and incidences, if Minneapolis said, you know what, we can't vote yes on a public safety commission, I don't have much hope for other cities, Memphis, Chicago, Detroit, Louisville, anywhere else in the country. What were, from your vantage point, what were the biggest challenges with issue 2? Why didn't more people in the community, because this wasn't just the non-people of color citizens of Minneapolis who voted no. There was a lot of Black and brown people who said, well, what are we going to do without the police? Unpack that a little bit for us from your perspective.
Right. So this is why this is the grown-up conversation. Anyway, because I think there's rhetoric that gets, blasted out, and people get caught up on phraseology, if you will, around defund the police and taking that and interpreting that sort of mantra as something that I don't even think that people who have this position in terms of what the people I'm aware of locally are even saying. So let me just start with that whole notion, and then I have some ideas about why I think the struggle is in terms of why in Minneapolis it hasn't, it didn't work, and it probably won't work. You know how when people say Black Lives Matter, there's an inherent implied thing that's not actually said, but understood. And the word is too, T-O-O. When people say defund the police, what they're actually saying, there's an implied defund police brutality. Because it's the brutality that people have always been protesting. It is not the police per se. It is the brutality that too often disproportionately targets Black bodies and abuses, kills, and maims them. Minneapolis has settled so many cases. We're not even talking about the ones where brothers and sisters end up dying. We're talking about even people who have been, I'm saying literally, like put in wheelchairs or harmed physically to the point where they can't work, or just even abused. And so, you can do it. You can look up the cases for yourself if anybody's interested. It's public record, and you'll see so many cases of lawsuits that have been settled because of police brutality. So when I talk about this idea of language, what we're saying is it's the brutality that needs to be defunded. And how? Okay, there's some ways, right? That's why this issue, right? They were talking about having again that renegotiation. What is a different way for us to think about keeping the peace in our communities that don't rely on, and this is where I'm going to with policing, a culture that's based on the beginning of catching Negroes and rounding them up. Some reasons that I heard, again, have to do with this idea that, this interpretation that, well, funding means we're going to have less police and we're going to, not use them, and when we really do need them. And what about crime? And what about, and again, the grown-up conversation is, let's talk about the actual statistics around crime. I know in Minnesota, one of the more pervasive and critical issues we have around crime is actually domestic violence that men commit against their female partners and women. And that happens in rural and in suburbs, and it happens all over the state. And we're not talking about that crime. So when they say crime, what are they talking about? We're not talking about the fact that drug use and drug trafficking and all that is just as pervasive in these white, rural, suburban areas as it is anywhere else. So I don't buy that argument about, well, what about all the crime? Or what about, if we're going to think more critically around coming back to an issue or any other issue about municipalities and other ways to reimagine and or renegotiate policing, it is to have this conversation around what we really mean, those of us who really are leaning into this issue. And there are a number of people who are doing this locally here, but with this conversation, because otherwise it gets reduced to whether or not, we're going to have police or not. And then, of course, there are people who are using this issue from the pro-protect the blue crowd who will suggest, well, see, we can't even hire police officers because we're just poor police officers. They're just getting beat up on. People are just, and so we can't. And then you look at the statistics, as again in Minnesota and Minneapolis particularly, two things. They don't have a critical shortage of police officers. They've hired more than they've ever had, and their budget is the biggest it's ever been.
Well, and I think that's the piece, right? Is there is so much, it's so pervasive that and accultured that they've taught us to fear. What are you going to do without us? It's almost like this Stockholm syndrome or this abusive relationship where, okay, I beat you up, but what you going to do without us? Do you want them? Right? I mean, because the reality is you're talking about the brutality. I would even exercise to say the occupation, right? That I heard a statistic at the time that Derek Chauvin murdered our brother George, that 94% of Minneapolis police officers did not live in the municipality, did not live in Minneapolis. And I'm not even talking close. I'm talking about Anoka. And for people who don't know, I'm not talking about collar suburbs. I'm talking about collar suburbs, like an hour away. And then you think about how schools are funded. Well, local property taxes. So we have occupiers in communities that have limited resources that are then getting paid those resources, and they are then buying homes and helping the preventative measures in communities 10, 15, 30, 50 miles away from the place that it is happening. And none of it is designed to prevent anything, right? At that time, I heard that Minneapolis's entire city budget, 85% of it was being spent on policing. And does it have the people feeling more safe? So it's very different for all of us who live in more of a suburban or a rural or an area. We live in a world where the police officer drives by and that person may live next door and they may still coach the Little League. That's not the same thing as people coming to the inner city of Minneapolis or the city of Minneapolis like they are going to the penitentiary. It is like you're a correction officer. You are showing up in a place that isn't even your place to occupy and dominate the very people that live there. And I think one of the pieces that people miss is someone said to me, well, defund. I'm just talking about reinvesting those resources in things that are proven to work? What about if we use those resources and invested them in schools and after school programs? What if we invested it in early childhood education, mental health resources? What if we invested it in homelessness and we invested in houselessness and ensured people had help? I just sat on a grand jury, Timothy, I tell you not. And the judge, we were on grand jury for a month. And I can't tell you one case that I saw that wasn't about drug addiction and mental illness, period. Right. And our solution is to just throw you in prison. Yep. Right. And then to add additional charges onto it in really menial and really crazy ways. So one of the things that even my mom said is when because she's a senior citizen and she has one of those fallen and I can't get up buttons. And every time she pushes the button, the first person to show up is a police officer. Mm-hmm. She has told dispatch in her suburban city, I don't want the police officer to come. Just send EMS. Because for her, it makes her nervous. Why is a person with a gun and how is that helping anything? And if a 78-year-old German Czechoslovakian white woman feels aggressed and intimidated by a gun guy showing up to help her get up, then can you imagine? And she imagines it. So the whole defund movement is just really simply the thing you're talking about, renegotiation of the people's resources, because the people deserve to feel safe. In particular, I mean, even in the case of Dante, why is a person with a gun pulling somebody over in a traffic stop? Those are the kind of things that then immediately things escalate, right? Why is that happening? So one of the things that I wanted to pivot to, because the incident with Tyre Nichols, one of the things that's really interesting is so many people who are not people of color, non-Black folks, were like, I wonder what they're going to do now, because these were Black police. Talk about why people thought it would be different. Well, these are Black police, so they're not going to harm. We're just going to recruit more minority police officers. Like somehow, like I said, dumping Perrier and Evian in the sewer is going to purify the sewer, right? So talk a little bit about that and talk about how one quote I heard and I repeated was, people that think that Black police officers killing Tyre has nothing to do with racism and anti-Blackness do not understand racism and do not understand anti-Blackness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a whole piece right there. You know, for me, thank you again for this entry point into another element that we need to have substantive conversations. And also we need to have educative conversations about, again, I'm trained as an educator first and foremost. And so I come from it with this idea of really thinking about, well, what is the foundation of these constructs around race? What are the different ways that our greatest thinkers and our, and our historians tell us about when these kinds of conversations and or topics were broached in the past? And so it's not a new conversation around, well, can Black folk be, do this against other Black folk? And then does that have anything to do with race or anti-Blackness and so forth? And the answer, quite simply, is yes, because race is made up. And just because you got Black skin doesn't mean you got Black consciousness. Because that's the construct is around and that's where anti-Blackness comes into it, as well as whiteness. As a Black man, it's perfectly reasonable for somebody born in this settler enterprise to have an anti-Black position because we're indoctrinated with that consciousness or lack thereof. And let me give you this, because Steve Biko, he grappled with this, the South African freedom fighter. Steve Biko said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So it's not new. So, because what were they doing? Why was he saying that? Because there were Black brothers who were being employed against other Black brothers and sisters to suppress them and to oppress them in apartheid South Africa. There have always been in this country, the same phenomenon. Like I think about the incredible story that is told by Alex Haley and Roots. There's a reason why in that story, when Kunta Kinte, right, who represents the enslaved, captured enslaved African, comes and then they change his name. And again, in the book, it's more descriptive than obviously the series, but there's a black man who they hand the whip to.
That's right.
Right? There's a black man they whip to. This is the pathology of creating anti-blackness, even for black people, so that they can lose their own consciousness about who they are, and also out of fear of, well, if I don't do this, this might be happening.
It's going to be turned to me, right? That whole Willie Lynch mentality of how to really, after Nat Turner and the Brothers Revolt in Virginia, then how are we going to control them? We'll start giving some a little bit more. Hey, I'm going to give you, I'm not going to make you eat the pig's feet. I might give you a little bacon. Right. I might, give you a mat rather than have you sleep on the floor. I might treat you. And then when you start doing it based on color of skin, hair, the same racism and anti-blackness that affects white America impacts Black America. And we're directing it on ourselves. Yes.
Oh, I mean, there's you just sparked another one for me. Like when I think about Fred Hampton, that self-preservation, right? And fear of when I'm in trouble, and if I have the opportunity, to not have that turned toward me, then I have to do, what I have to do for my own self-preservation. So that brother had somebody on his inner circle who gave them his whole layout so that they could assassinate him. These are the tactics that white supremacy have always been employing upon us and using people in ways, again, but they also rely on what I'm saying, though, and that is, so if we talk about how these Black brothers in Memphis, how could they do that, and then does race have anything to do with it? It is perfectly reasonable based on our history and based on this notion of what Black is and what Black isn't, that they could lose their consciousness, even if it was for that, even for that 30 or whatever many minutes. I suspect it was for a lot longer than that, because you don't go into a culture of policing and probably not already be somewhat not conscious around what Black is. And let me just finally say this other thing about Black, because I think it's important, because even for Black folk, oh man, brother, this is good. So there's an element to this, even for us. Because I think I posted something, about this whole thing too. My brain was going about humanity, right? Anti-Blackness is coupled with inhumanity because, again, the consciousness around human beings, especially people with black and brown skin, also is the element that implicit association with them not being fully human. So not only is whiteness at play or anti-Blackness, but there is a dehumanizing quality to lead to even Black folk doing that to themselves. And again, we saw the real life version, but think about John Singleton. I don't know how many years ago now with Boys in the Hood, where the black cop pulls up and he got Cuba Gooding Jr. up against the car. And what does he do? He pulls out the gun and puts it in his face. And of course he employs the N word and basically says, I can just end you without a thought.
And it's that level of self-hate, the hate of anti-Blackness, the dehumanizing. I was thinking the same thing. Shout out to the homie Chuck D for Every Brother Ain't a Brother. Right? Every brother ain't a brother, right? I mean, I'm thinking of that from 89? Welcome to the Terror Dome, right? And thinking through these processes and how in the white community, I think folks see Black and think it's a skin thing. And like you said,
right.
It's a kin thing.
That's right.
Right? Oh, that wasn't bad.
That's
that
right.
For us, it's a different feel. We know if we're navigating policing, the most brutal of overseers and of police are the brown ones. And once you become the police, you are the police, and we
Mhm.
navigate you like you're the police, period.
And this is why I think it needs to be renegotiated, because when you put this out there again about human beings, the people who are saying that, I would probably surmise to say, have never been in a condition where their life was threatened by someone who actually has the powers of state. Because I ran from the police actually one time, and I got away. They couldn't catch me. I was a younger brother. In fact, at the time, I was an all-state track. I was in high school actually at the time, and I ain't got no shame in saying, man. I mean, I use all of that athletic ability, and it was a response, like you said. It was like, okay, I could stay here. They were coming at me, and they had already had their at that time. I mean, they had clubs, they had stuff out, and I made a decision. Like I could try to explain that, hey, I didn't do anything and take that whooping, or worse, or I was like, you know what? They're just far enough away. I think I can get away, and I did. I outmaneuvered them. I ran for some block. I was dipping and diving. And the thing is, like, I've been in that situation. So when people say that to me, I go, see, you've probably never been in that situation where your very life is a talk about they have a split second decision. So did I. I was like, you know what? No, I'm not going to stay here. I'm gonna run. And so my thing is, based on what you've been saying as far as this concept of, and I've been saying about literacy and about really recognizing, putting people in situations and thinking through these things. One of the things that I said to a group of people just recently around what they can do, is I said, you got to contemplate what kind of conversations you're having with each other in white spaces too. Because when you're getting literate, probably one of the biggest things you can do from that vantage point is you got to start doing what some sisters and brothers are doing, our white brothers and sisters are doing in those spaces, by saying, no, I'm going to talk to y'all. I'm going to talk to my family. I'm going to talk to people in these spaces about the literacy that's necessary for us to actually do more coalition building. And so, D'Angelo talks about that, how white folks need to talk to white folks, and I know there's others who are doing. Chris Crass is talking about, who's a whiteness studies scholar who's doing a lot of that work. But for me, as an educator, yeah. I mean, and then around policing particularly, I think we have to imagine, like, what is it, like you said, what is it like in your neighborhood? I asked some white people just recently, do you speed ever? Did you ever speed, and whether it's intentional or not? If you're honest, you probably speed, and sometimes you know your speed, right? You get caught. Do you ever think you get put over for speeding? Ever think they're going to shoot you or beat you or tase you? No, you probably ain't thinking that. That's how we have to start building this literacy. Like, give them these episodes that these things happen to everybody. But what's different is when it happened to people like you and me, like Adam and me and you, like when it happens, like the difference is we got the potential for it to go sideways real quick. And they have to start thinking about that kind of literacy, because it's not like white people don't get stopped and they don't, go through red lights, or they don't, have traffic quote unquote violations or all of that. But it's the difference is they don't ever have to think about, wait a minute, this might mean my life. That's literacy to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it all starts with the space we're in, right? We created a space called Get Uncomfortable because this child of Black, German, Czechoslovakian folks know that we don't talk about certain things at family gatherings because we have the privilege to avoid uncomfortable. And it isn't until we create safe and powerful and appropriate community where uncomfortable conversations start to become comfortable that we can all work through all of these things. Dr. Berry, I thank you for sharing community, for sharing your wisdom, Black man. I appreciate you. As we always say, stay aware, stay woke, my brother. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
My guy, it's always good to see you, man.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Get Uncomfortable. Get Uncomfortable is produced in partnership between Adam Smith and me, Rachel Hansen. There are a number of ways that you could support the show, and we would appreciate any support you could give. You can leave us a review anywhere you listen to podcasts. You could send us an email, and our email addresses are in the show notes, or you can share an episode with a friend. This will help us to build community and promote true healing through uncomfortable conversations. Until next time, stay uncomfortable.